10,000 talents. Say it slowly. Let the weight of it sink into your bones. 10,000 talents. You're probably doing the math wrong. Everyone does. The first time they hear this number, a talent wasn't a coin you could slip into your pocket. It was a unit of weight, about 75 pounds of silver. 1 talent was worth roughly 20 years of a common laborer's wages, 20 years of breaking your back in the fields, of calloused hands and bent spine, of sunrise to sunset labor. 10,000 talents. That's 200,000 years of wages. 200,000 years. The entire annual tax revenue of Herod's kingdom, all of Judea, Samaria, and Edomiah combined, was only 900 talents. This servant owed more than 10 kingdoms. And here's where the story gets interesting. Because Jesus didn't pull this number from thin air. When he sat with his disciples that day, when Peter had just asked him about forgiveness, "Lord, how many times shall I forgive my brother when he sins against me? 7 times. Jesus didn't just say 77 times, or 70 times 7. No, he told them a story about a man who owed an impossible debt. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me tell you about Matthias. That wasn't his real name. Jesus never gave him one. But every servant has a name. Every man who falls has a story. So let's call him Matthias, because it means gift of God. And isn't that the most bitter irony? A gift of God who forgot what gifts were. Matthias wasn't always a debtor. Once, he was the king's trusted servant. Not just any servant, he was what we might call today the chief financial officer of the entire kingdom, the keeper of the books, the man who knew where every denarius flowed, where every talent was invested. The king trusted him with everything. Trust. That's where all betrayal begins, isn't it? With trust. Picture him in his prime. Matthias walking through the marble halls of the palace, his sandals clicking with authority, servants bowing as he passed, merchants waiting hours just for 5 minutes of his time. He had the king's seal, the king's authority. When Matthias spoke, it was as if the king himself had spoken. And somewhere, we don't know when exactly, but we know it happened. Somewhere Matthias looked at all that money flowing through his fingers and thought, just a little. The kingdom is so vast, the king so rich, he'll never notice. The first time was probably small. A talent here, redirected there, a false entry in the ledger. His heart probably raced for weeks afterward, waiting for the knock on his door that never came. But it didn't come, so he took more. It's like drinking salt water when you're thirsty. The more you drink, the thirstier you become. The villa in the countryside, the vineyard, the stable of Arabian horses, the banquets that went till dawn. Matthias wasn't just stealing anymore. He was building an empire within an empire. How does someone steal 10,000 talents? You don't do it overnight. This is years, maybe decades, of systematic betrayal. This is creating false provinces that paid false taxes. This is inventing entire trade routes that existed only on paper. This is genius-level deception. And every night, Matthias went to sleep thinking, tomorrow I'll stop. Tomorrow I'll find a way to pay it back. But tomorrow never comes for men like Matthias. Until one day, it does. The kingdom's accounts will be settled. 7 words. The messenger probably said them casually. Another routine announcement. But for Matthias, these 7 words were the sound of the world ending. The throne room had never seemed longer. Every step Matthias took toward the king's throne felt like walking through deep sand. The marble columns that he'd passed 1,000 times now seemed to lean in, watching. The other servants, his subordinates, his accomplices, some of them, lined the walls. They knew. Somehow, everyone always knows when someone's about to fall. The king sat on his throne, and here's what's remarkable. He wasn't raging, not yet. He was doing what kings do, settling accounts. This was business. Routine. A kingdom runs on numbers, on ledgers balanced and debts paid. Matthias, the king said, and even his name sounded different in the king's mouth now. Not familiar, formal, final. The scroll was produced, not scrolls. Scroll, singular, because when you owe 10,000 talents, you don't need multiple documents. You need one number that says everything. Have you ever been in a moment where time seems to stop, where you can hear your own heartbeat like thunder? Where you can feel every drop of sweat forming on your forehead? Matthias stood there, and for one insane moment, he thought about running. But where do you run from a king? Where do you hide from someone who owns everything you can see? 10,000 talents. The king read, and the number hung in the air like smoke from a sacrifice. The hall was silent. Even breathing seemed too loud. And then the king said 3 words that were both completely expected and utterly devastating. Pay it back. Pay it back. As if Matthias could reach into his robes and produce 10,000 talents. As if any human being could. The king might as well have said, bring me the moon. Carry the ocean in your hands. This is where the story turns. And if you're not paying attention, you'll miss the genius of what Jesus is doing. Because the king knows Matthias can't pay. Everyone in that throne room knows it. This isn't about getting the money back. That money is gone. Transformed into 1,000 luxuries. Dissolved into a decade of deception. No, when the king says pay it back, he's following the law. The ancient law. The only law that matters when the debt is impossible. He ordered that he be sold, along with his wife and children and all that he had, and payment to be made. Sold. Not just Matthias, his wife, who maybe knew, maybe didn't. His children, who definitely didn't know why their father came home some nights and locked himself in his room and wept. Everything he had built with his stolen fortune, all of it to be liquidated, turned into whatever pathetic fraction of the debt it might cover. A strong slave might sell for 1 talent, maybe 2 if he had special skills. Matthias, his wife, his children, everything he owned, maybe 30 talents, against 10,000. It wasn't justice. It was what you do when justice is impossible. It was the period at the end of a sentence that should never have been written. And then Matthias did something that changed everything. He fell. Not gracefully, not with dignity. He collapsed. Really, his knees hit the marble with a crack that echoed through the hall. And from that position, face to the ground, dignity abandoned, pretense shattered, Matthias said words that he probably rehearsed 1,000 times but never believed he'd actually say. Have patience with me, and I will pay you everything. Listen to those words again. Really listen. Have patience with me, and I will pay you everything. It's absurd. It's like a child promising to clean up the ocean they've spilled. Like a man falling from a cliff asking for just a little more time to learn to fly. Matthias is promising to pay back 200,000 years of wages. If he lived to be as old as Methuselah, if he worked every day for 900 years, he couldn't pay it back. Everyone in the throne room knew it was impossible. The king knew it. Matthias knew it. But here's what Jesus wants us to see. Sometimes, when you're on your knees, when you've got nothing left but impossible words, you say them anyway. Because what else is there? The king looked down at this man, this thief, this betrayer, this destroyer of trust, groveling on his perfect marble floor, the same floor Matthias had walked with such pride. The king could have laughed, he could have raged, he could have given the signal and had Matthias dragged away. Instead, something moved in the king's chest. The Greek word is splagnisme. It means to be moved in your bowels, in your guts. It's the same word used when Jesus saw the crowds and had compassion on them. It's visceral, it's physical. It's what happens when someone else's pain suddenly becomes your pain. The king looked at Matthias, really looked at him, not at the thief who'd stolen 10,000 talents, but at the broken man on his floor, the husband, the father, the human being who'd lost himself so completely that he'd promised the impossible rather than face the inevitable. And the king did something that nobody in that throne room would ever forget. Rise, he said. Matthias probably didn't hear him at first. His face was still pressed to the floor, his words still tumbling out, promises to work, to sacrifice, to find a way, somehow, to make it right. Rise, the king said again, louder, this time. Matthias lifted his head. Tears had made tracks through the dust on his face. The debt is forgiven. 4 words. 4 impossible words. Not reduced, not rescheduled. Forgiven, cancelled, as if it had never existed. 10,000 talents gone. 200,000 years of wages erased. The greatest debt in the history of the kingdom dissolved like morning mist. The hall erupted. Scribes scrambled for their ledgers. How do you account for 10,000 talents that simply aren't? How do you balance books when the king just tears out the page? But the king wasn't done. Release him, he commanded, because forgiveness without freedom is just delayed judgment. Matthias stood there, swaying slightly, like a man who'd been carrying a mountain and suddenly found it gone. He was free. He was forgiven. He was, impossibly, still the king's servant. He should have left that throne room a changed man. He should have floated out, weightless, reborn. He should have, but that's not what happened. The sun was blinding after the dim throne room. Matthias stood in the courtyard, blinking, trying to make sense of what had just happened. His wife and children, they were safe. His life, somehow still his. The debt that had crushed him for years, that had stolen his sleep and poisoned his food, gone. He should have been dancing. He should have been singing. He should have been on his knees again, but this time in grateful prayer. Instead, he was thinking, you see, when you've been drowning and suddenly find yourself on dry land, your first instinct isn't always gratitude. Sometimes it's panic, because if you're not drowning anymore, what are you? Matthias had defined himself by his debt for so long that being free from it left him ... empty, confused, or maybe, and this is the darker possibility, maybe Matthias never really believed it. Maybe he thought the king would change his mind. Maybe he thought it was a test, a trick, a cruel game. Maybe when you've lived in deception so long, you can't recognize truth when it forgives you. We don't know what was in Matthias's head, but we know what he did next. He saw Simon. Simon was a fellow servant, not high-ranking like Matthias, just another face in the palace's endless hierarchy. A man who did his work, collected his wages, went home to his family. Unremarkable except for one thing. He owed Matthias money. 100 denarii. Let's be clear about this amount. A denarius was a day's wage. 100 denarii was about 3 months' salary. Not nothing. It could buy food for a family for months, could pay rent, could make the difference between comfort and struggle. But compared to 10,000 talents, it was like comparing a grape to a vineyard, a drop to an ocean, a spark to the sun. 10,000 talents to 100 denarii is a ratio of 600,000 to 1. Simon was walking across the courtyard, probably heading home after his shift. He saw Matthias, and here's the telling detail. He tried to change direction, because everyone knew about Matthias's debt to the king, which meant everyone also knew about the smaller debts owed to Matthias. Simon had probably been avoiding him for months, but Matthias was faster, or maybe just more desperate. The grab was violent. The Greek word is kratesis. It means to seize with force, to arrest, to take control. Matthias didn't tap Simon's shoulder. He grabbed him by the throat. Pay back what you owe me. The same courtyard that had just witnessed mercy became an arena of violence. Other servants stopped, stared. This was Matthias. The same Matthias who'd just walked out of the throne room free. The same Matthias who'd been forgiven an impossible debt. Simon's response was almost word for word what Matthias had said to the king. Have patience with me, and I will pay you back. But here's the difference. Simon could actually do it. A few months of hard work, maybe a small loan from relatives, selling some possessions. It was doable. Simon's promise wasn't impossible. It was just inconvenient. The parallel should have hit Matthias like lightning. The same words, the same posture. Simon was on his knees now, just like Matthias had been moments ago. The same plea for time, for patience, for mercy. But Matthias didn't see it, or couldn't see it, or, and this is the most terrifying possibility, he saw it and didn't care. Because here's what we need to understand about Matthias in this moment. He'd just experienced the complete dissolution of his identity as a debtor, but he hadn't yet built a new identity as someone forgiven. He was in a kind of spiritual vertigo, grasping for something solid, something that made sense. And what made sense to Matthias was the old rules. You owe, you pay. No, Matthias said. One word, the opposite of everything he'd just received. He had Simon thrown into prison until he could pay the debt. Prison, for 100 denarii, for 3 months' wages, for 1/600,000th of what he'd just been forgiven. The other servants watched in horror. They'd seen both scenes, the forgiveness in the throne room, the violence in the courtyard. The disconnect was so jarring, so incomprehensible, that they couldn't stay silent. Think about the courage that took. These were servants reporting on someone who, despite everything, was still higher ranking than them. Matthias still had power, still had influence, but what they'd witnessed was so wrong, so fundamentally upside down, that they risked their own positions to report it. They were greatly distressed. Matthew tells us, the Greek is pupa lipou. It means a deep, grieving sadness. Not anger, primarily, but sorrow. They were heartbroken by what they'd seen. Because here's what those servants understood, that Matthias didn't. When you've witnessed radical mercy, you've seen what the world could be. And when someone who's received that mercy refuses to pass it on, they're not just being hypocritical, they're destroying hope itself. The second summons came at night. No announcement this time. No formal invitation. Just guards at Matthias's door, their faces unreadable in the torchlight. The king commands your presence. Now, the walk to the throne room was different this time. The first time, Matthias had known judgment was coming, but held on to a fool's hope. This time, he knew something else was happening. Something worse. The throne room was nearly empty. No audience of servants, no scribes with their ledgers. Just the king, a handful of guards, and shadows that seemed deeper than before. The king didn't wait for Matthias to approach. His voice carried across the vast space, and it was different now. Not the measured tone of a monarch settling accounts. This was personal. You wicked servant. 3 words that stripped away any pretense, any remaining dignity. Not Matthias, not my servant, wicked servant. The adjective had replaced his name. I forgave you all that debt because you pleaded with me. The king was standing now, something he rarely did during court proceedings. This wasn't court. This was a father confronting a child who'd taken his gift and thrown it in the mud. All that debt, the king repeated it, as if he himself couldn't quite believe what he'd done. 10,000 talents, gone, because you pleaded with me, because you fell on your face and begged, and I had mercy. The word mercy in Greek is elio. It's not just pity or sympathy, it's active compassion, the kind that costs something. The king's mercy had cost him 10,000 talents. It had cost him the respect of some advisors who thought him weak. It had cost him the precedent. Now other debtors might expect similar treatment, but he'd paid it, willingly, completely. Should you not have had mercy on your fellow servant, as I had mercy on you? This question, this is the heart of everything. Not a command, you must have mercy. Not a statement, you didn't have mercy. A question, should you not have had mercy? It's the kind of question that answers itself. It's the kind of question that reveals not just what you did, but who you are. Matthias had no answer. What could he say? That he'd forgotten that 100 denarii was somehow different. That mercy received doesn't automatically create mercy given. But his silence said everything. The king's next words were terrible in their simplicity. In anger, his lord handed him over to the jailers to be tortured until he should pay back all he owed. All he owed, the debt was back. 10,000 talents, 200,000 years of wages. The impossible number, impossible again. But this time, there would be no falling on his knees, no pleading, no mercy. Because mercy rejected becomes justice perfected. The word for tortured is pistis. It originally referred to someone who tested gold by rubbing it on a touchstone. The torture wasn't primarily punitive, it was investigative. They would squeeze from Matthias every hidden asset, every secret account, every possible source of repayment. But we all know the truth. There wasn't enough. There would never be enough. Matthias would die in that prison, and the debt would die with him. Unpaid and unpayable. The servants who heard about it later would whisper about the irony. Matthias had put Simon in prison for a debt that could be paid in months. Matthias was in prison for a debt that couldn't be paid in millennia. Now we need to pause, because Jesus didn't tell this story just to entertain. He told it to answer Peter's question, and Peter's question came from a very real problem. Lord, how many times shall I forgive my brother when he sins against me? Up to 7 times. Peter thought he was being generous. The rabbis of his day taught that you should forgive someone 3 times. 3 strikes and you're out. It was based on Amos 1. For 3 transgressions, and for 4, I will not revoke the punishment. So 3 times was considered complete forgiveness. Peter more than doubled it and added 7, the number of perfection, of completion. Surely, Peter thought, 7 times was the outer limit of reasonable forgiveness. But Jesus, as he always did, shattered the framework entirely. Not 7 times, but 77 times, or 70 times 7, depending on your translation. Either way, it's not about the number. It's about losing count. It's about forgiveness that doesn't keep score. And then he told this parable, and now we see why. The 10,000 talents, that's us. That's every human being who's ever lived, standing before a holy God with a debt we could never pay. Not because God is a harsh creditor, but because the debt is real. Every lie, every cruelty, every moment of selfishness, every opportunity for good that we walked past, it adds up, and it adds up to more than we could ever repay. Some people bristle at this. I'm not that bad, they say. I've never stolen 10,000 talents, but that's missing the point. The number isn't about quantity, it's about capability. Whether you owe $1 million or $1 billion doesn't matter if you only have $5 in your pocket. The point is the impossibility, and God, the King in this story, does the impossible. He forgives completely. As far as the east is from the west, so far has He removed our transgressions from us. Psalm 103:12. But here's where it gets uncomfortable. The 100 denarii, that's the person who cut you off in traffic, the friend who betrayed your confidence, the spouse who said that thing that still hurts years later, the parent who wasn't there, the child who rebels, the colleague who took credit for your work. Real debts, real pain. But compared to what's been forgiven you, pocket change. And Jesus is saying, not suggesting, not recommending, but stating as cosmic fact, that forgiveness received must become forgiveness given, not because it's nice, not because it's therapeutic, but because that's how the kingdom of heaven works. It's the physics of grace. This is how my heavenly Father will treat each of you unless you forgive your brother from your heart, not from your teeth, gritted in reluctant obedience, not from your mind, convinced by theological argument, from your heart, from the place where mercy was first received. But here's what's brilliant about this parable. It reveals why we don't forgive. It's not because the hurt is too big. It's because we've forgotten how much we've been forgiven. Matthias's problem wasn't that Simon's debt was too large. It was that Matthias had already forgotten his own debt. How does that happen? How do you forget 10,000 talents of forgiveness? The same way you forget any miracle. You explain it away, you minimize it, you normalize it. Maybe Matthias walked out of that throne room thinking, well, the king must have owed me something too. Maybe I deserved forgiveness. Maybe the debt wasn't really that bad. We do the same thing. We minimize our own sin. Everyone does it. It's not that bad. God understands. And we maximize others' sins against us. You don't understand what they did. You don't know how much it hurt. They don't deserve forgiveness. But the math doesn't work. It never works. Because 600,000 to 1 is the kind of ratio that breaks our normal categories. It's the kind of comparison that should short-circuit our unforgiveness before it even starts. Let me tell you something about prison that Jesus' original audience would have understood immediately. Simon, thrown into debtor's prison, had hope. His family could work to raise the money. Friends could contribute. The debt could be paid. But Matthias, handed over to the torturers. His prison was different. It was the prison of an unpayable debt. It was forever. But here's what we miss if we're not careful. Matthias built his own prison before the king ever sent him there. The moment he grabbed Simon by the throat, he was already in chains. Think about what unforgiveness does to a person. You replay the hurt over and over. You imagine conversations where you get to say what you really think. You fantasize about their comeuppance. You check their social media, hoping to see them struggling. You interpret everything through the lens of that unpaid debt. Who's in prison? The person you won't forgive might be living their life, might not even remember what they did. But you're checking the locks every day, making sure the debt is still recorded, the sentence still standing. Corrie ten Boom, who survived the Nazi concentration camps, once said, "Forgiveness is setting a prisoner free, and discovering the prisoner was you." But Jesus is saying something even more radical. He's saying that unforgiveness doesn't just imprison us psychologically or emotionally, it imprisons us spiritually. It cuts us off from the very forgiveness we've received. This isn't God being petty. This isn't cosmic karma. This is about the nature of reality in God's kingdom. Mercy is like breath. You can't only inhale. Try it. Try to only breathe in without breathing out. You'll suffocate. Not because breathing is punishing you, but because that's not how breathing works. Forgiveness works the same way. Receive, give, receive, give. It's a rhythm, a circulation. And when we stop the flow, when we receive but don't give, something dies in us. The early church father Chrysostom put it this way: not forgiving is like drinking poison and expecting the other person to die. But there's something else in this parable, something hidden in plain sight. When the other servants saw what Matthias did to Simon, they were greatly distressed and reported it to the king. They didn't celebrate. They didn't say, "Finally, Matthias is getting what he deserves." They grieved. Because when someone who's been forgiven much refuses to forgive little, it's not just wrong, it's tragic. It's watching someone throw away a winning lottery ticket. It's watching someone choose chains when they've been given wings. There's a detail in this story that most people miss. When the king forgave Matthias the first time, he didn't say, I'll give you more time. He didn't say, pay me half. He tore up the ledger. The debt didn't just become manageable, it ceased to exist. In the ancient world, debt records were kept on papyrus or clay tablets. When a debt was forgiven, the record was physically destroyed, broken, burned, gone. This is what the Apostle Paul was talking about when he wrote that God has cancelled the written code with its regulations that was against us and that stood opposed to us. He took it away, nailing it to the cross, Colossians 2:14. The ledger torn, the record destroyed. The debt not postponed but obliterated. But Matthias couldn't live in a world without ledgers. That's the real tragedy. He'd been given a new life, a fresh start, a blank page, and the first thing he did was start keeping score again. 100 denarii. He probably had it written down somewhere. Date of loan, terms of repayment, interest accrued. The irony is devastating. His own debt had just been erased, and he's pulling out his notebook to make sure Simon's is still recorded. This is what Jesus means when he talks about forgiving from your heart. It's not enough to say the words "I forgive you" while keeping a mental spreadsheet. It's not enough to release someone from their debt while secretly hoping life will collect it for you. Real forgiveness tears up the ledger. So here's the question this parable forces us to ask. Which servant are you? Are you Matthias before the king, overwhelmed by a debt you could never pay? Then hear the good news. The king is willing to forgive, not because you deserve it, not because you can earn it, but because that's who he is. The Lord is compassionate and gracious, slow to anger, abounding in love. Psalm 103:8. Are you Matthias in the courtyard, freshly forgiven but struggling to extend that same mercy? Then remember the ratio. Remember the 600,000 to 1. Remember that whatever someone owes you, it's pocket change compared to what you've been forgiven. Are you, Simon, in prison for a debt someone won't forgive? That's harder, because this parable doesn't really address Simon's fate. He's collateral damage in Matthias's tragedy. But know this, your imprisonment in someone else's unforgiveness doesn't define your worth. And sometimes, the Simon in the story is the one who looks most like Christ, suffering unjustly, waiting for redemption. Are you one of the watching servants, grieved by the unforgiveness you see around you? Then speak. Do what they did. Don't celebrate the downfall of the unforgiving, but grieve it, and point always to the King who forgives. But here's the deepest question. Why did Matthias refuse to forgive? I think it's because he never really accepted his own forgiveness. He heard the words, he walked out free, but deep down, he still believed in the ledger. He still believed debts must be paid. He couldn't accept grace for himself, so he couldn't extend it to others. This is why some of the most unforgiving people are also the most religious. They're still trying to pay back their 10,000 talents, still trying to earn what's already been given, still keeping score in a game that ended when the king said, "Forgiven." The hardest person to forgive is often yourself. And until you do, until you really accept that your 10,000 talents are gone, forgiven, forgotten, you'll keep demanding your 100 denarii from everyone else. Let's talk about the king for a moment. Because in all our focus on Matthias and his failure, we might miss the most stunning character in the story. This king forgave 10,000 talents. Do you understand what that means for a kingdom? That's not personal money. That's national treasury. That's roads not built, armies not paid, hospitals not funded. The king's forgiveness had public consequences, and he did it anyway. Why? The servant's master took pity on him. That's how most translations render it. But the Greek word, again, splagnisme, it's visceral compassion. It's your gut twisting when you see someone's pain. It's physical, not philosophical. The king looked at Matthias, this liar, this thief, this betrayer of trust, and felt his pain, literally felt it. And that feeling was stronger than justice, stronger than economics, stronger than the precedent it would set. This is not how kings behave. This is not how power works. Except in the kingdom of heaven, where the king is also a father, where justice serves mercy, where love rewrites the rules. But notice, the king's mercy had its expectation attached, not a condition. The forgiveness was complete when given, but an expectation that mercy received would become mercy given, that Matthias would leave that throne room transformed, that he would become in his small sphere what the king had been in his large one, an agent of impossible forgiveness. When that didn't happen, when Matthias grabbed Simon by the throat, the king's anger was as visceral as his mercy had been, not cold, calculated anger, hot, personal, grieved anger. The anger of a father whose child has learned nothing. The anger of love betrayed. In anger, his Lord handed him over to the jailers. This isn't God losing his temper. This is God taking sin seriously. Because unforgiveness is not a small sin. It's a denial of the gospel itself. It's saying, God's mercy is real for me, but not through me. It's damming up the river of grace. Let me bring this home. Because you might be thinking, I've never owed 10,000 talents. I've never thrown anyone in prison. This story isn't about me, but it is. It absolutely is. Every time you replay that conversation where someone hurt you, adding new zingers you wish you'd said, you're Matthias checking his ledger. Every time you bring up that old hurt in a new argument, you re-Matthias demanding his 100 denarii. Every time you say I forgive you but add but I'll never forget, you're Matthias, keeping the prison ready just in case. Every time you wait for them to apologize first, to admit they were wrong, to make the first move, you're Matthias, standing over Simon with your hand on his throat. The social media post, where you subtly call them out. The prayer request, that's really gossip. The concern you share, that's really revenge. The silence that speaks louder than words. The presence withheld. The affection withdrawn. The joy you won't let them see. These are the modern prisons. These are the 100 denarii we demand, while our 10,000 talents lie forgiven and forgotten. And here's what makes it worse. We spiritualize our unforgiveness. We call it boundaries when it's really revenge. We call it wisdom when it's really fear. We call it justice when it's really hate. I'm not saying boundaries aren't important. I'm not saying wisdom isn't needed. I'm not saying justice doesn't matter. But when these become excuses for unforgiveness, we're building our own prison, bar by bar. Forgive us our debts, as we also have forgiven our debtors. Jesus taught us to pray this. Every time, link our forgiveness to our forgiving. Not because God's forgiveness depends on ours. The king forgave Matthias before Matthias did anything. But because forgiveness is a package deal, you can't keep one side without the other. But here's the hope. The same king who forgives 10,000 talents also empowers 100 denarii forgiveness. We're not doing this alone. We're not mustering up mercy from our own empty reserves. Bear with each other and forgive one another if any of you has a grievance against someone. Forgive as the Lord forgave you. Colossians 3:13. As the Lord forgave you. That's the power source. That's the well we draw from. Not our own magnanimity, but His. Not our own strength, but His. And sometimes, often, forgiveness is a process, not a moment. You forgive today, and tomorrow the hurt comes back, and you forgive again, 70 times 7, until forgiveness becomes muscle memory, until mercy becomes reflex. C.S. Lewis wrote, I think that if God forgives us, we must forgive ourselves. Otherwise, it is almost like setting up ourselves as a higher tribunal than Him. The same applies to forgiving others. When we refuse to forgive someone God has forgiven, we're setting ourselves up as a higher tribunal than Him. We're saying our standards are stricter than His, our justice more exact. But that's not the worst part. The worst part is what we miss, because forgiveness, real forgiveness, the kind that tears up ledgers and opens prison doors, is the closest we ever get to being like God. Creation is amazing, but God alone creates ex nihilo. Healing is wonderful, but bodies still eventually die. But forgiveness, when we forgive, we're doing exactly what God does. We're releasing debts. We're restoring relationships. We're choosing love over ledgers. So also my Heavenly Father will do to you, if you do not forgive your brother from your heart. These are hard words, maybe the hardest Jesus ever spoke, because they seem to make God's forgiveness conditional on ours. But that's not quite right. It's not that God withdraws forgiveness already given. It's that unforgiveness puts us in a place where we can't receive what's being offered. It's like closing your hand so tight around your 100 denarii that you couldn't open it to receive 10,000 talents. The unforgiving servant wasn't sent to prison because he failed a test. He was sent to prison because he revealed that he'd never really left it. He'd been freed from his debt, but not from his debtor's mentality. He'd been released from his chains, but not from his need to chain others. Peter asked, "How many times?" Jesus answered, "Stop counting." Peter was thinking in terms of obligation. Jesus was thinking in terms of transformation. Peter was worried about being taken advantage of. Jesus was worried about Peter's soul. Because here's the final truth. Forgiveness isn't just something we do, it's something we become. children of a Father who forgives, citizens of a kingdom where mercy triumphs over judgment, people who've been forgiven too much to withhold forgiveness from anyone. The story ends with Matthias in prison, but your story doesn't have to. The ledger can be torn today. The prison doors can open now. The 100 denarii can be released this moment. Not because it's easy, not because they deserve it, not because it doesn't matter, but because you've been forgiven 10,000 talents, because the King has had mercy on you, because this is how the kingdom works, because this is what love looks like with skin on. The servant who owed everything and was forgiven everything should have become the servant who forgave everything. That opportunity was lost for Matthias, but not for you. Not yet. Not if you can hear these words and let them change you. 10,000 talents, forgiven, 100 denarii. Forgive. It's not a suggestion. It's not a high deal. It's the physics of grace. It's the mathematics of mercy. It's the only way any of us make it home. Lord, how many times shall I forgive? And Jesus, looking at Peter, looking at us, says, until you stop counting, until mercy becomes who you are, until you see in every debtor a fellow servant who owes you nothing compared to what you've been forgiven, until the ledger is not just torn but forgotten, until the prison you built for them becomes the freedom you both walk in. Forgive as you have been forgiven, not for their sake alone, not even for your sake alone, but because that's what children of the King do. That's who we are.